Welcome to Nomadic Diaries, a podcast revealing secrets of life lived overseas. We use storytelling to deliver insight and information on what it takes to live, love, move, and travel across the globe. Our guests are professionals from the world of global mobility. We hope that by opening their diaries to share their wisdom, that you, our listener, can benefit and enjoy more ease and grace in your expat life abroad.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Sharon Fields, the co-host of Nomadic Diaries podcast. Today, we're joined by Doreen Cumberford, my host, and our guest, Roy Kraft from San Miguel de Allende, Mexico.
Thanks, Sharon. And thank you, Roy, for being here. I have just a few notes I'd like to share about Roy and why we're interviewing him today. Roy appreciates having the ability to have led a fascinating and an extraordinary life. His travels have taken him to every U.S. state, and it says you lived in 10 states and 40 countries. Does that mean you lived?
I've traveled to 40 countries. I've lived in 10 states.
10 states, okay.
Yeah, this is the 25th place I've lived, San Miguel, as a city. But it's been in 10 states. It's been in Tokyo, but not a lot. I haven't lived as an expat in a lot of places. It's really here and in Tokyo. But I have traveled and worked in all kinds of countries.
Tell us about Tokyo, because you and I have that in common. I always look for the commonalities across our communities. When were you in Tokyo?
I was in the middle of my longest sort of career was in the international automobile business. I had a very interesting multicultural experience. I was an American working for a Swedish company that was run by European version of General Motors in Japan. And I was sent over there not knowing anything other than what I'd learned in school about Japan, didn't know Japanese. But it was a fascinating experience, and that was in the early 90s.
Oh, we were there at the same time.
And my daughter was 4 months old when we moved to Tokyo. And it was one of those experiences that was so different that I wouldn't say that I experienced culture shock, although I read a lot about it. But I had to sort of put my assumptions about how the world worked and how business worked on the shelf and explore very different things. And when it comes to understanding culture, in fact, one of the greatest gifts I got is about a month after I moved there, I met a guy, a Brit, older gentleman who had lived as an expat in Tokyo for 40 years and had written several books about being an expat. And he said, in my experience, there are three kinds of expats. There's the ones that come here, in this case to Japan, and try to go native. They dress, in their kimono, they decorate their entire house Japanese, they immerse themselves in the language, and they pretend like they're Japanese. And he says, the problem is, they ain't never going to be Japanese.
Right.
Then there's another group that pretend that they're still back in the States or back in England or wherever they're from. And so they bring all their furniture over, they send their kids to the American school, they go to the American club, and they just sort of, it's like going outside to Disneyland and then coming back into your apartment. And he said, and there's a third group, and it's the smallest group, but I think the most successful. And they are ones who basically take a thing to say, well, that's different, not better, not worse. So they put their assumptions about things aside and just look at things and explore it. And one of the greatest examples that I have used over and over again is in the city of Tokyo, many streets do not have street names.
I remember this.
and especially if you don't know Japanese, you couldn't read them anyhow, but they don't have a name at all. Right. And the street numbers are not like ours that are sequential. Right. The first number is the ku, or the borough, and there were 13 at the time. I don't know how many today. And then there was one about kind of here, it's like the Colonia and then the Fracciamente. The next number was which neighborhood are you in? And the last number, which was really the one that kind of boggles your mind, it was the year in which the building you're in was built.
Yes.
And, the sort of engineer type, the American way or the Western way is the way just couldn't understand it, and to say, it's not a better system or a worse system. It's a different kind of
It's
logic.
different.
And
Yeah.
when you take that approach where you're kind of like, that's interesting, it makes life much easier.
Doesn't it? That's such
It
a great lesson to, we'll put that down as one of your first quotes for our listeners.
I love that because
Well,
it's so true. I think about here in Mexico and
Oh,
the
absolutely.
expats, and it's so true.
Well, and I meet some at times that are really frustrated with how things are because they expect it to be the way they used to. And we all have that built-in, what I would say, ethnocentric bias, where we grew up in a certain culture. But if we're not able to put our assumptions about that culture that formed us aside, we're going to be antagonistic. We're going to be a cultural critic as opposed to a cultural learner.
And that's another great phrase, cultural critic instead of a cultural learner. Listeners, are you writing this down? Because this is really gold stuff, I have to say.
Yeah, I have to give credit where credit's due. Is about 10 years ago, after many years of doing work with organizational development and looking at different ways to interview people and gather information, I realized that, and I'll get back to that in a minute, because that's the sort of conversations of consequence in a conversation. But I ran into a group that were from Dubai that were doing intercultural intelligence training.
Yes, I've been involved in some of those trainings.
Yeah. Well, there's a group called Knowledge Works, and they were an international group of people. And I helped bring them to the U.S. to do several certification trainings, and I went through it myself. And they talked a lot about being a cultural learner as opposed to a cultural critic. But it was what I really liked about them, and I did some research of the cultural competency movement in the States and books I read. Most of our research, in fact, what people don't realize is culture is humankind's greatest creation.
It is.
And most complex one, because if we look at the academic fields of anthropology, sociology, linguistics, those are all philosophy, those are all parts of culture. But the problem with culture is only about 10% of it is really seen.
Yeah.
It's not visible. And there's a quote from one of the early cultural competency to say that most of what culture has to offer is hidden, especially from those who are in it. So we don't see the hidden parts of our own culture. And so we wind up taking what we know and what is sort of in our bones, but we don't really have an awareness of, and we then pit it up against another culture. And one of the teachings of this group was that in order to be productive, because most of their work was how to work interculturally in an organization, when you have people like in Dubai, where they're from 90 different countries, all in the same office, is you have to create a third cultural space. So you have to have there's your space with your understanding, the other person from the other culture, and then where is that other place where you can find shared things to agree on and to explore together.
And that's where we build the third culture, or the bridge. That's where we start to build bridges.
Absolutely, yeah. Because if not, we're always going like this, and we get this sort of mind is better than yours, which organizations do, cultures do, and individuals do.
So can I tell you a wee story? I remember once we were going to, I think, a birthday party in Tokyo, and this was my first experience of the coup numbers, the block numbers, and the year the building was built. I remember our daughter was 2 and 3 years old. We lived in Yokohama. Just off of Honomokodori. And we lived in the Intelligent and Smiling House. That was the title on the outside of the building. Yeah. But I remember we were going to a birthday party in Tokyo, and the driver got really frustrated because he couldn't figure out where it was anywhere on the block. And it was the first time it had happened to us. It happened to us many times, but the first time is sort of jarring. He has these white gloves, and he just pushed his white gloves and he pressed the button, and the back doors flew out, and he yelled at us, and we scurried out of the car just wondering, where the heck is this? It turned out, of course, it was 2 or 3 stories up, and we had to do some walking to get there. But it was just funny to me how scared I was of the Tokyo taxi drivers.
Oh, and they're so polite and so precise, and
yes,
the gloves and the seat covers and everything. Yeah.
Yes.
But he was out of his comfort zone.
Yes,
I had the really great, privilege because I was there as the president of this subsidiary of a Fortune 5 company. So I had this very wonderful administrative assistant who was from Tokyo, and she realized that Tokyo is so vast, it's now almost 40 million people, twice as big as Mexico City, that most taxi cab drivers don't know the whole city.
Yes.
So they know their area. So every time I went somewhere, she would give me a piece of paper, like a half sheet, and on one side was a map and the instructions in English, on the reverse was in Japanese.
Yes.
So that the taxi driver could do it and I could find my way back. And it made life much easier.
That was the early Google Maps.
Oh, well, you're talking about, I mean, I was faxing things back to Sweden and back to the US. But it was fascinating, especially to have an ongoing business relationship with the local Japanese company with the headquarters in Sweden, many of which were other European countries, and then the United States, and to see how differently they did things.
Yes.
Like language. One of the things I found out right away is I would fax something to the US or to Sweden, and they would immediately send back a response. Often they missed the point. The Japanese would wait much longer, but every time the communication was perfect because they read, looked up every single word, made sure they perfectly understood it, and then sent back the reply. Where, the Americans assumed they knew what I meant. The Swedes thought they knew what I meant. And we had more miscommunication between those two than I did with the local Japanese.
And they're very intentional. That was one of the things. My husband grew up in Japan. And so I think he had a sensibility from his 4 years he lived there as a child of the way things worked. And when he left, they had a leaving party for a big part of the team, and they asked him to stay behind, and they dismissed all the other expats. And then they got up, and he just shared this the other night. We were asked to share something we were most proud of. And he said it was one of the highlights of his career was that the Japanese all got up and gave him a standing ovation and that's sort of unheard of in Japan. That is not Japanese. That is not Japanese culture, but he felt so appreciated by them. But I think it was because he had something that was wired into his brain as a child that he recognized when he walked into those meetings. And so you can have a more harmonious outcome.
Well, and it's not that you can't develop some of that if you're not born into the culture. One of the experiences I had in talking about language is Akamura-san, who was my counterpart in the Japanese company. I was struggling trying to take Japanese, before work on Saturday mornings, and my head was exploding because I was working 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. I mean, I've never worked so hard in my entire life. And I went and asked him about, this getting to know Japanese. And he said, I meet a lot of foreigners who have very good Japanese, but sometimes that's the only skill they have. I need someone who understands business. You understand business. We can always get a translator. And I had no Japanese, that we had to communicate at such a basic level, what I would call, and they would call, you get to know someone by belly to belly at the bar.
Right.
And this was heart-to-heart communication that when I left, and I left pretty quickly because my daughter had some health issues, had people coming back to say goodbye, scurrying from all over Tokyo, and with tears in our eyes. And so it was, you make a connection, and it's not about the words.
No, it's not about the words. That's what I call global-heartedness. And that's one of the things we want to be known as on this podcast, is that we are encouraging and supporting a global-hearted community who feel like we may be separated, and we're just using tech, obviously, but that we can build the heart of the feelings and the experience of culture.
Well, one of the things my wife reminds me of is that all people want to be seen, want to be heard, want to be respected, and want to be appreciated. And she takes it upon herself that even whether it's back in the States or here, she finds even someone who's not particularly pleasant or friendly, and she will keep working on them and making conversation and opening them up. I don't have quite that much patience, but I understand the intent. And so it's like, divulge a little bit. I had the wonderful opportunity in Atlanta. I worked for a nonprofit, and I worked quite heavily in the faith community and a lot in the African American community. And then I went to work for Morehouse College, which is an all-male, all-black institution.
Yes. Yes.
And I was the only white person on the staff.
Wow.
And it was one of the most amazing cultural immersion experience in my life. But what I realized is a lot of my counterparts didn't really understand about reaching out to another culture. And I would have people who were working with a church and said, can you help me? I want to reach out with our program to the African American community. And my first question would be, well, do you have any black friends? And I'd be met with this silence. It's almost like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. And I say, well, if you're really serious, here's what I suggest, is every Monday morning at this certain location, there's a meeting of the concerned black clergy. And I'm not clergy and I'm not black, but I'm concerned and I'm a member. And I will definitely bring you there as my guest. And you can come, you can introduce yourself, you can listen. And if you keep coming back a number of times so people get to know you, and then you offer to help somebody else in the program they're working on, then after a while, then and only then should you tell them about your program. Most of the people never took me up on my offer because they wanted to do it quickly, the American, but the problem is when you're going to a different culture, and I said a lot of people in the black community are very suspicious of white people coming there to work with them because they've been taken advantage of. And I'm sure there's an awful lot of that most gringos don't experience or hear about, but is true in Mexico. Mexicans have been taken advantage of plenty, not only by the United States, but a lot of different foreign groups. But having that awareness to say you're a visitor, and people like you don't really have a great historic track record. It's a good mindset to know about and to be aware of.
Yes. Well, that's terrific. Can you tell us a little bit about conversations of consequence? And I bet that we're going to have you back again to finish this. Please tell us a little bit more about having conversations of consequence and how that applies to when you're living in another culture. And do you we're going to have a lot of follow-up questions in here, I think.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I did a lot of work in organizational development and in change initiatives in a variety of different settings. And I, about 30 years ago, was searching for a methodology to use in sort of gathering information from people about organizations. And I got very deeply involved with something called appreciative inquiry, which is a organizational change methodology that instead of looking at what's wrong and what's broken and how to fix it, it looks at what's good and positive and how to do more of it.
Yes,
and
I'm familiar with it.
What I loved about using it, and I started to practice it, in group settings, but also one-on-one, and I started just for my own benefit, doing it and then asking give me 6 other people. And I, over the course of a year, I did like 150 of these 90-minute interviews. And I had people break down in tears. I had people say, I've worked here for 10 years. You're the first person who ever understood me. And all these things, because I wasn't focusing on me. I was focusing on what made them come alive. So that's where, and one of the guys that I got to know used appreciative inquiry in philanthropy. And he basically was a pioneer in the fundraising world, and he realized that most of the focus was on person as a prospect to get money from. And he said, I want a methodology to use in philanthropy that honors the donor as much as the donation. And he realized after, that David Cooperrider, who invented appreciative inquiry, lived 10 minutes away from him in Cleveland. So when he got together, he used it there, and I studied with him for a while. And that's where I came up. That was actually, it's his conversations of consequence, and I added over time, is we have a lot of conversations that are really not consequential. But when you're able to go deeper, and appreciative inquiry allowed me to do that, and other things where we're talking about, what was vital to him. Howard Thurman, don't ask, what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive.
Ask what makes you come alive.
And when you ask someone what makes them come alive, they do right in front of your eyes, right?
Right.
One of my friends was an 82-year-old retired bishop in the United Methodist Church, and I did this interview with him. And the last question I asked him was, what is the greatest contribution you yet want to make in your life? Tears just streamed down his face because he said, I thought my contributions were over. So I have probably done one-on-one appreciative inquiry interviews at this point, at least 1,000 people.
Wow.
And I've used it in group settings to do strategic planning, to do a whole variety of things. But I found it was the best methodology to get the interviewer take the focus off the interviewer and put the focus on the interviewer.
Yeah. And do you use this in Mexico at all, or?
Well, I can't help not using it. So it's really infused all aspects of my life. But what I realized as I started to move about the time, a little bit before I got involved in intercultural intelligence training, is I realized that there was something still a bit missing, and it was really missing in me, in my perspective, is when I was working either at Morehouse College, or I was working I did a lot of interfaith work in intercultural work in Atlanta, is that I could see people talking past one another because they were talking from different worldviews. And so they might have used the same words, but the words didn't mean the same things.
Yes.
So what I tried to do is say, let me use intercultural intelligence, the skills and the worldview understanding, and lay that on top of appreciative inquiry. So you're asking questions about what's good and positive and working, and how do we do more of it? So that's kind of the basic thing. And then you're asking it from the perspective of understanding this person may, like, for example, the word service. The word service may mean a totally different thing in one culture from another. And in the knowledge works, they talk about their three basic worldviews, the sort of Western guilt, innocence, the honor, shame, there's three, and then sub meanings behind it. And so the more familiar you are with that, and also with your own cultural background, for example, living in Japan, working at Morehouse College, those cultures changed me.
Of course they did.
And so you become, what I say is, my goal is to become omniculture, is that I look at things and say, that's interesting, and I say, I really like that better than what I, learned and grew up with. Let me incorporate that into me.
So how do you use this on a day-to-day basis? I bet Sharon is dying to ask that. She's just dying to ask this question. I can tell.
That was exactly what I wanted to know.
Well,
do you just start talking to somebody at the restaurant? What do you do?
How does this work? We want practical.
Well, one thing I do is I observe my wife, because my wife is the magnet for people. She will sit down on the bench at the parochia, and people will just come up to her, Mexican, non-Mexican, and start talking to her. And we'll ask her, and talking to her in Spanish or in English, and she just meets them where they are and just sort of lets them open up. What I try to do is, and whether I'm doing it with folks, I'm doing a thing with, I'm kind of coaching some folks who are working on doing vocational discernment. So they've asked me to be on this Zoom call with the 3 or 4 other people who are putting this program together in the States. I will use my knowledge, because they're really coming from a different, even within the American culture, there are a lot of subcultures, different than me, and different religious background than me. But I'm using what I know from Appreciative, is I'm asking them, instead of, what are you trying to fix, is what are you already doing that's really exciting? What's working for you?
And so you ask the Mexicans this? Do you,
what I do is, in order to do this, the problem with conversation is time.
Yes.
Is you have to take the time, and you have to have conversations over time where you get to know the person. So example, Kimberly, who grew up in Latin America. She lived 5 years in Mexico City, Panama City, Bogota, Port-au-Prince, Manila, all kinds of places. But she still never feels like her Spanish is very good. So she's always learning more. And she's a beautiful student, and that's something she loves to do. But in one of her schools, the woman who is kind of the administrator, of course, Kimberly and Claudia have become great friends. And Claudia's father-in-law, we got to know because he's a plumber, and he came over, and we got to know him, and we got to know a little bit. And he invited us when he was doing work out at some artist gallery, and then we got to know Claudia's husband, Adal, who is this wonderful guy. Now, Miguel Angel, the father, and Adal, the husband of Claudia, don't speak hardly any English. So sometimes, I use Kimberly to translate, but more and more, I work side by side with them when they come over here to do something and get to know them. And we always have coffee. We always have, some postres or something. It's not just about a transaction. They're not just a plumber. They're a friend. They're a person.
Yes.
So, we were walking down the street, and Claudia and Adal just had a baby. So, and we went to their wedding. So in a sense, you just start to get to know them as people. But that takes time to cultivate.
It does. We're lucky here in that our next door neighbor is our, what would you call Hugo, Sharon? He's a contractor, he's an architect, but he's become our cultural mentor because he comes over and gets his photograph taken when somebody has a birthday, and he's just, it takes time, and it also takes proximity. Exactly. And I find that it takes proximity even in San Miguel, which is so small.
Well, it also takes intentionality.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the people who Kimberly has known for decades, and this woman has lived in San Miguel for probably 25 years. And she was a little bit brusque with Kimberly, saying, well, why are you spending so much time learning Spanish? Your Spanish is good enough. And Kimberly very, calmly, politely said, well, because I love Mexico. I love the language. I love the people. I want to learn as much as I can. I'm doing it for me. I'm not doing it to be more proficient. That comes along. But the other thing that this woman said that was kind of shocking to me is, well, I don't find the Mexican people very friendly. They never say hi to me first. And it was like, well, you are the guest in their country. And I didn't relay this to her because I didn't think she would have ears to hear. But I told this story to a number of people. One day when I was working at Morehouse College, my dad came to visit, and I took him down to where the King Center and King's Birth Home, Martin Luther King's, there's a whole row of Ebenezer Church. And we were walking along the street, and all of a sudden an elderly black woman came walking towards us. And before we could even think, she stepped off the sidewalk, off the curb into the street to go around these two white men. And it was so disturbing that her first thing was to get up. And what I told a lot of my white friends in Atlanta, most white people don't even see black people when they walk past them on the street. They don't make eye contact. Well, if you make eye contact here in Mexico or in Atlanta, and you smile and you say good morning, guess what? They'll smile and say good morning back to you.
That's why we love it here, right, Sharon?
That's right. And that seems to be a theme that we've had a previous
but you have to be intentional, and you have to pay attention, and you have to, not everyone will respond to you. Some gringos won't say good morning to you, and some Mexicans won't. But if you say good morning to everyone you meet, the overwhelming majority, and you smile, they will smile back and say good morning. And what's funny is you'll start to, there's start to be teasing that'll happen. Is I was walking past a Mexican gentleman about my age, and I said, Buenos dias, and he kind of looked outside and he says, good morning, Hovind. So it was a little bit, it was kind of because Hovind has got kind of a mixed, it's youth, but it's also, young man, but it also can be derogatory. But he was playing with me. And so you can play back.
Yeah, they can be very playful.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
we're going to have to wrap this up very soon.
Sure.
Can you please, could we complete this by, can you give us some ideas of if someone is thinking about moving to Mexico and they're faced with living in a culture they've never lived in before, could you give us just two things that they need to think about and prepare for mentally? I'm talking about sort of the mindset part of this. What are the two things that you think are the most precious commodities you can carry in your brain when you move to another country?
You know, there's a really well-known quote by Marcel Proust that said, and this gets at, you know, the thing that maybe we could talk about at another time, is the real voyage of discovery is not seeking new lands, but seeing with new eyes.
Yes.
And so it's wonderful to do all the research that you can do online, but when you come to the place, what you have to open yourself up to is, how does it make you feel? Mm-hmm. You have to get in touch with the emotions. And I often would use poetry or other things like that to get people out of their analytical thinking and to say, go and just experience the beauty. Go and experience, you know, different things. But you also is realize the greatest obstacle to your success is inside you, and you have to change from within. You have to be willing to, in a sense, be transformed.
Yes, it's all about transformation.
It
well,
is.
Thank you for this. Sharon?
It's wonderful to have had you. Thank you so much. I want
Absolutely.
all the listeners to make their notes and think about what two things would they take with them to another country. Not in their suitcase, but in their mind and in
the
their
problem that Ram Dass once said is, you know, the problem with going somewhere else is you're going to take your same head with you.
and your heart.
The only thing that can impact the head is the heart.
Yes.
Right. So I hope all the listeners will share with their friends what they've learned today, and like us on Facebook, Instagram, and subscribe to our episodes that come out every Tuesday. And Roy, we thank you so very much, and I will see you around San Miguel.
Indeed. Thank you so much, ladies.
Thank you so much, Roy.
Bye-bye.